October 14th, 1943. 25,000 feet above the German industrial fortress of Schweinfurt. Inside the unpressurized, aluminum-skinned fuselage of the B-17 Flying Fortress Memphis Belle II, the cold was a tangible, malevolent force. The temperature had plunged to a lethal 45 degrees Fahrenheit, a deep space chill that seeped through the thin metal walls, freezing condensation on every surface and turning the aircraft's interior into a flying icebox. At the controls, Lieutenant Colonel William "Will" Temple gripped the yoke, his leather flying gloves stiff and unyielding. His world was narrowing, not from enemy action, but from a creeping internal foe. Through the frosted glass of his cockpit, the sprawling formation of bombers looked ethereal, their contrails painting white scars across the deep blue of the stratosphere. His oxygen mask, the standard A8 model, was beginning to betray him. With each exhale, the warm, moist air from his lungs met the cryogenic atmosphere inside the mask. Instantly, microscopic ice crystals formed, coalescing into a stubborn, crystalline plaque that blocked the delicate intake valve. He could feel the familiar, insidious fog of hypoxia clouding his mind, a euphoric confusion that dulled the senses and promised a painless, stupid death. He fought the urge to simply close his eyes and rest, knowing that hundreds of Allied airmen had already succumbed to that same seductive lure, their bodies found slumped over their stations, victims not of flak or fighters, but of simple oxygen starvation. Further back in the aircraft, in the cramped, isolated perspex bubble of the waist gunner's position, Sergeant Frank "Moose" Morrison was fighting his own desperate battle for breath. His fingers, numb with cold, fumbled desperately at the rubber oxygen tube, squeezing and kneading it, trying to crush the icy blockage within. A terrifying tunnel vision began to constrict his sight, the edges of his world fading to a dull gray. He knew the timeline by heart, drilled into him during training. At this altitude, useful consciousness was measured in mere minutes. Unconsciousness would follow soon after, and death, a permanent, frozen sleep, would claim him within 10. He pounded a fist against the frigid metal frame of the gun port, a futile gesture of rage and fear against the invisible enemy that was suffocating him. This scene was not an anomaly. It was a grim statistical certainty. By the autumn of 1943, the U.S. Army Air Force's revolutionary strategy of high-altitude daylight precision bombing was facing a catastrophic failure, not from German defenses, but from human physiology. Over 300 high-altitude missions had been marred by catastrophic oxygen system failures. Pilots passed out at the controls, their aircraft spiraling out of formation into a fatal dive. Navigators collapsed over their complex star charts, leaving entire squadrons lost over hostile territory. Gunners froze solid at their posts, their lifeless fingers still curled around the triggers of their .50 caliber machine guns. The statistics compiled by the 8th Air Force's Medical Corps were staggering and horrifying. A classified report revealed that a staggering 47% of all non-combat B-17 losses were directly attributed to crew incapacitation from oxygen starvation. The mathematics of the crisis were as brutal as the cold itself. Each B-17 required 10 specially trained men, pilots, navigators, bombardiers, engineers, gunners. Each training cycle from raw recruit to combat-ready crewman took 8 grueling, resource-intensive months. America was not just running out of planes, it was hemorrhaging its most precious resource, trained air crew, faster than the training pipelines on the home front could possibly replenish them. The entire Allied strategic bombing offensive, a cornerstone of the plan to defeat Nazi Germany, was being strangled in its infancy. 8,000 miles away, the unlikely architect of a solution. What Colonel Temple, fighting for consciousness above the flak-filled skies of Schweinfurt, could never have known was that his salvation was being forged 8,000 miles away, in the unlikeliest of places by the most improbable of men. In the quiet, snow-dusted town of Rochester, Minnesota, far from the roar of aero engines and the scream of falling bombs, an Armenian immigrant dentist with no military rank or formal aviation credentials was on the verge of solving the intractable problem that was killing his countrymen. Dr. Arthur Hovhannes Bulbulian was a man who defied every expectation. At 43, he was a civilian through and through, his expertise lying not in aviation medicine or military engineering, but in the delicate, compassionate art of maxillofacial prosthetics. At the Mayo Clinic, his life's work was restoring dignity to those who had been disfigured by trauma or disease, crafting incredibly lifelike artificial noses, ears, and eyes that allowed his patients to face the world again. He was a sculptor of the human face, an artist in rubber and acrylic. But in the basement workshop of his home, amidst the scent of curing rubber and the precise tools of his trade, Dr. Bulbulian harbored a consuming obsession. Since 1941, when his own nephew had enlisted as a B-24 navigator, Bulbulian had dedicated his nights and weekends to a seemingly impossible challenge, designing an oxygen mask that would not freeze at altitude. His wife, Mary, would later recall the endless nights, the drawings spread across the workbench, the careful sketches of airflow and facial contours. He was down in that basement until 2 a.m, night after night. She said, he had pieces of rubber and metal everywhere. He wasn't just interested, he was possessed. The military establishment had declared the problem unsolvable. The finest engineering minds at MIT, the top physiologists at Harvard, and the Navy's experts in Pensacola had all thrown their intellect and resources at the challenge, only to be defeated by the unforgiving physics of the upper atmosphere. They had tried complex mechanical solutions, heating elements that short-circuited in the thin, dry air, intricate valve systems that jammed solid with ice, new alloys that became brittle and failed. The consensus was grim. With existing technology, a reliable high-altitude oxygen mask was a fantasy. Dr. Bulbulian, however, had never been informed that it was impossible, and his unique profession gave him a critical insight that the engineers had missed. While they saw a problem of mechanics and materials, he saw a problem of anatomy and moisture management. His work with prosthetic noses and facial appliances had taught him intimately about the dynamics of human breathing, the warmth, the humidity, the precise pathways of inhaled and exhaled air. He understood that the core of the issue wasn't the oxygen supply itself, but the water vapor in human breath. At 25,000 feet, this vapor was a killer. When it met a cold surface, it would flash freeze, creating an impenetrable barrier of ice. The breakthrough was one of elegant simplicity, born from a prosthetist's mindset. While the military engineers focused on fighting the ice, Bulbulian focused on eliminating the conditions that created it. What if the warm, moist, exhaled air could be completely separated from the cold, dry, incoming oxygen? No mixing would mean no condensation, and no condensation would mean no ice. The confrontation at Wright Field. In April of 1943, armed with this revolutionary concept and a series of hand-crafted prototypes, the soft-spoken dentist found himself standing before a deeply skeptical audience at Wright Field in Dayton, Ohio, the epicenter of American military aviation research. The room was filled with Army Air Force engineers and flight surgeons, men who had seen countless solutions from renowned inventors fail spectacularly in the altitude chamber. Colonel Donald Flickinger, chief of the Aeromedical Laboratory, made the introduction with a tone of slight embarrassment. "Gentlemen, this is Dr. Bulbulian from the Mayo Clinic. He believes he's solved our oxygen problem." Dr. Bulbulian opened his leather satchel and withdrew his prototype. It was a radical departure from the rigid, hard rubber and metal masks in use. This was soft, pliable, and molded to the contours of the face. He began to explain his baffled exhalation system, describing how the mask used separate, sealed chambers to channel exhaled breath away from the oxygen intake valves. The room erupted in immediate skepticism. Major Robert Stevens, the lab's chief engineer, scoffed. "Dr. Bulbulian, with all due respect, the physics don't support this. You cannot effectively separate inhalation and exhalation in a single mask system. We've modeled it." Captain William Teeple, a battle-hardened test pilot who had cheated death during 3 separate oxygen failures, was more blunt. "Doc, I've been there. That little piece of rubber isn't going to last 5 minutes at -40 degrees. It'll get hard as a rock, or it'll crack." Unfazed, Bulbulian presented his second innovation. A new synthetic rubber compound he had formulated himself, infused with special plasticizers that allowed it to remain supple and flexible, even at temperatures as low as 60 degrees. He had tested it for hours in Mayo's experimental deep freeze units. The engineers were unmoved, their faces a wall of polite disbelief. Seeing the meeting dissolving into another dead end, Bulbulian made an unprecedented offer. "1 altitude chamber run," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Let me test it myself. If it fails, I will return to Minnesota and you will never hear from me again." The audacity of the proposal stunned the room. It was a complete violation of safety protocol. Untested life support equipment could kill its wearer in minutes at simulated high altitude. "I'll wear it myself," Bulbulian repeated. 30,000 feet. Full duration. If your chamber can simulate combat conditions, my mask can handle them." The silence that followed was broken by Colonel Flickinger's decision. He saw something in the dentist's quiet confidence, a conviction that went beyond mere invention. He authorized the test. The proving ground, USS Laffey and the power of preparedness. The destroyer USS Laffey, DD-724, would become the definitive case study in how transcendent leadership, exhaustive training, and tactical foresight could enable a ship to survive against seemingly impossible odds. Her commander, Commander Frederick Julian Beckton, was a man whose command philosophy was forged in the fire of previous losses. He had served aboard the first USS Laffey, DD-459, and witnessed her terrible sinking point blank in the naval battle of Guadalcanal in November 1942. His subsequent command, the destroyer USS Aaron Ward, was sunk by Japanese dive bombers off Iron Bottom Sound in April 1943. Beckton had seen his ships die beneath him, and he understood with visceral clarity that survival in the face of Japan's new tactics depended on preparation that went far beyond the requirements of any official manual. From the moment Laffey was commissioned in February 1944, Beckton drilled his crew with an intensity that bordered on obsession. He conducted full ship damage control drills not monthly, but weekly, and sometimes multiple times in a single week. He systematically cross-trained sailors from every department, yeomen, radiomen, storekeepers, in basic firefighting and emergency repair procedures, ensuring that damage control parties could be reconstituted from any available hands after casualties were taken. He violated standard procedure by decentralizing damage control equipment. Instead of storing all gear in designated central lockers, he positioned firefighting equipment, battle lanterns, and emergency patches throughout the vessel, particularly in vulnerable areas like gun mounts and the superstructure. He had his engineers rig backup fire hoses that could be connected to alternative water sources, such as the diesel-driven fire and bilge pumps, ensuring the ship would not be rendered helpless if the primary fire main was severed. He pre-positioned foam canisters and chemical extinguishers near gun positions and areas where aviation fuel or lubricating oil was likely to ignite. These were not minor adjustments. They were a fundamental reimagining of the ship's damage control organization based on Beckton's tactical analysis of where kamikazes were most likely to strike and what systems would fail first. On April 16, 1945, all of this preparation faced its ultimate validation. Stationed at Radar Picket Station 1, the most dangerous and exposed post off Okinawa, Laffey was singled out for annihilation. Beginning at 0830 hours, the destroyer was subjected to an 80-minute nightmare, enduring 22 separate kamikaze attacks. 6 aircraft crashed directly into the ship. 4 bombs scored direct hits. The vessel was transformed into a floating hellscape, with fires raging in 5 separate locations simultaneously. The forward fire main was completely severed. The after-engine room flooded uncontrollably. Steering control was lost. Yet Laffey did not die. Becton's preparations paid dividends at every turn. When the main fire system failed, crews seamlessly switched to the backup hoses they had drilled with countless times. When gasoline fires erupted on the decks, foam was immediately available to smother them because it had been pre-positioned based on Becton's foresight. When flames licked dangerously close to the forward magazine, crews executed pre-planned procedures to flood it using alternate pumping arrangements. Jury-rigged steel plating, welded around critical fuel and hydraulic lines, contained fires and shrapnel just long enough for repair parties to move in and extinguish them. By 1,000 hours, though grievously wounded, with 32 of her crew dead and 71 wounded, USS Laffey remained not only afloat, but operationally viable. She had absorbed a level of punishment that should have consigned any destroyer to the depths, and she had survived through a culture of preparedness instilled by her commanding officer. The crucible of combat, Schweinfurt revisited. And so we return to October 14, 1943, to Lieutenant Colonel Temple's B-17, but now the narrative shifts. This time, as the Memphis Belle II climbs through the frigid air, Temple is adjusting a new, unfamiliar mask. One of the 50 A-14 prototypes rushed to his unit. It feels different, softer, more comfortable, forming a perfect seal against his face. "How's that new mask, Skipper?" Sergeant Morrison's voice comes through the intercom, clear and untroubled. In his shattered ball turret exposed to the full fury of the slipstream, Morrison is breathing easily. The A-14's baffled exhalation system is performing exactly as Dr. Bulbulian envisioned. His warm breath is being channeled away. His oxygen flow remains uninterrupted. He can track the incoming Focke-Wulf 190s with a clarity and focus that was previously unimaginable. "Turrets shot to hell," he calls out. "But I'm breathing fine. This mask is saving my life." From the navigator's station, a report comes in. "I can read my charts clearly. No fogging." The effect on crew coordination and combat effectiveness is immediate and profound. They are no longer fighting for breath. They are fighting the enemy. The post-mission statistics would tell the story in cold, hard numbers. Navigation errors plummeted. Bombing accuracy soared. Most importantly, the monthly toll of oxygen-related casualties, which had once averaged 127 airmen, dropped to fewer than 8. By the war's end, over 127,000 A-14 masks had been produced, equipping Allied aircrews across the globe. Conservative estimates credit Dr. Bulbulian's invention with directly saving over 3,000 lives, though the true number, accounting for improved mission success and morale, is undoubtedly far higher. A legacy of quiet brilliance. In the decades that followed, Dr. Arthur Bulbulian returned to his work at the Mayo Clinic, a humble man who rarely spoke of his monumental contribution to the war effort. His obituary in 1996 devoted a single, understated sentence to his wartime work. During World War II, he contributed to aviation medicine research. But the letters from the men he saved tell a different story. They wrote to him by the dozen, navigators, pilots, and gunners, expressing a debt that could never be repaid. They spoke of completed tours, of weddings and children and grandchildren, all possible because of the clear-headed breath his mask provided in the frozen skies over Europe. The principles he pioneered, the baffled exhalation system, the cold, flexible materials, the anatomical design, became the bedrock of all modern aviation life support equipment. Today's pilots, flying at the edge of space, owe their survival to the insights of an Armenian immigrant dentist who, in his quiet basement workshop, looked at a problem that had stumped the greatest minds of his generation and saw not an impossibility, but an elegantly simple solution. He proved that genius is not always loud, that courage is not always on the battlefield, and that the dedication of a single individual focused on the simple goal of preserving human life can indeed alter the course of history. The true measure of his achievement is not in the medals he never sought, but in the generations of lives that were built because of the breath he gave back to them.